This is Istanbul in modern Turkey. To the west lies Europe, to the east, Asia, stretching all the way to India and China. I'm Matthew Settle. In 334 BC, Alexander, king of the tiny Greek kingdom of Macedon, crossed this neck of water and headed east into the mighty Persian Empire ruled by Darius III. Both Alexander and Darius had one ambition: to rule the known world. In the war that followed, the winner would take all. The decisive battle was fought 3 years later, on 1st October 331 BC, on the dusty plain of Gaugamela.
Now, with new video game technology, you are about to see this great battle as never before.
The vast numbers of soldiers, the troop formations, how they fought, and how the battle was won. Get the view the generals wish they'd had. Now, in decisive battles.
The chain of events that led to this great battle began far away from the dusty plains of Persia. In 356 BC, a son was born to King Philip of Macedon and his wife Olympias. His name was Alexander. Philip was the most powerful king in Greece. But the various states were difficult to hold together. He saw a war against Greece's old enemy, Persia, as a way of uniting the country and making himself all-powerful.
But Philip had problems at home. He already had 6 wives, and in 337 BC, he married a 7th, a young teenager named Cleopatra. Olympias was furious. She feared her son Alexander might never become king. The following year, in 336 BC, Philip was assassinated. Everyone suspected that the murder was organized by Olympias, and as she'd hoped, her 20-year-old son Alexander inherited Philip's throne and his ambition to conquer Persia.
I think Persia was the dragon that he needed to slay. It was like sacking Troy times 100.
The Persian Empire was vast, stretching all the way from modern-day Turkey, through Iraq and Iran, to Afghanistan and northern India. But this spurred Alexander on. He was insatiably curious. He wanted to see the lands that lay beyond Persia, and the ocean that was believed to encircle Europe and Asia, at the edge of the earth.
Alexander was a hunter and a conqueror, and he set himself no limits. His first task was to defeat the existing Persian Empire. Second task, to recover the old Persian Empire, which he would have known about, which extended over the Hindu Kush into what's now Pakistan. Third goal, well, the limit, which was, as the Greeks thought, the ocean. He just simply wanted to go on until he hit the Eastern Ocean.
He was competing with Achilles, with Heracles, and he wanted to leave a name that would live forever and ever.
In 334 BC, he arrived here in Turkey with an army of 40,000 men.
Although basically Macedonian, the army included troops from all over Greece and a large number of mercenaries. At its heart were the companion cavalry, an elite unit of around 1,600 men.
Alexander's particular contribution was that he led the companion cavalry, the crack cavalry force, in person, and he had done so from the age of 18, so the troops would know that their leader was not just there because he was the son of the previous king, but because he was one of the finest horsemen in the entire army.
Alexander's companion cavalry were probably the greatest cavalry ever in the history of the world. They were companions of the king. They were the elite of all Macedonia, who could call Alexander Alexander, and who were his friends, his mates.
The Persian army was sent to throw this young upstart back across the Hellespont. The two sides met at the river Granicus.
Alexander led the cavalry charge across the river. He rode straight for Mithridates, the son-in-law of Darius, and plunged his lance into his face, killing him outright. Then 2 Persian generals attacked Alexander,
One dented his helmet with a sword swipe, but was killed by Alexander. The second general came at him with an axe, but as he raised it, his arm was cut off at the shoulder by one of Alexander's companions. The rest of the Macedonian cavalry and infantry raced across the river. The Persians turned and ran. Alexander drove on eastwards through Asia Minor. He believed that fate had marked him out for greatness. Now the Persian king, Darius, decided to take charge himself. He raised another army and met the Macedonians in November 333 BC at Issus. Darius heavily outnumbered Alexander, but the battleground was not large enough for him to use his superior force to advantage. Once again, Alexander's cavalry smashed through the Persian line. Darius fled with such haste that he left his mother, wife, and daughters behind. They became Alexander's captives. Meanwhile, thousands of Persian troops were cut down as they made their retreat. These victories made Alexander the master of all those lands to the west of his advantage. These now included Egypt, which Persia had ruled for 200 years. He traveled there, and as Egypt's new pharaoh, founded the city of Alexandria. He then made a pilgrimage to the shrine of the god Ammon. This was at the Siwa Oasis, near the border with Libya, and involved a trek of several hundred miles across the desert.
Questions to Ammon were answered through a priest. Alexander asked, "Will I rule the earth?" The answer seems to have been yes. But the priests went further. They greeted Alexander, calling him the Son of God. 2,000 years after his desert pilgrimage, Greek coins still depict Alexander as the ram-headed god Ammon.
All those who knew Alexander claimed Egypt had changed him. In his own mind, he had become godlike and invincible. By July 331 BC, his army was ready for the push eastwards into the heartland of Persia. 3 months later, he crossed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Darius was waiting for him on the plain of Gaugamela. The Persian king had learned from his defeat at Issus. Gaugamela, which means the camel's house, was absolutely flat. Darius chose to fight here so that he could use his cavalry and chariots to full advantage. He would gamble everything on stopping Alexander once and for all. For if his army was defeated here, the entire Persian Empire would have a new ruler, Alexander the Great. It is 331 BC. Alexander the Great is battling against the army of Darius of Persia. At stake, control of Asia, from the Black Sea to the borders of India. Darius, his army was huge, 250,000 men, outnumbering Alexander's 5 to 1. Curtius Rufus, a historian of the time, described how the Persian army snaked across the desert. First came the cavalry, drawn from all parts of the empire. Next in line were crack infantry troops, known as the Immortal, so called because their numbers were never allowed to drop below 10,000. 10,000 spearmen, then 30,000 foot soldiers, and 400 of his own royal horses. 600 mules and 300 camels carried the king's treasure, which in today's terms would be worth over $3 billion. Alexander's army in comparison was rough and ready, and much smaller. 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. It was a confident army. Alexander, at the head of his companion cavalry, led from the front.
The Macedonians really were a band of brothers. They really were companions. Every night they would eat together, dine together, drink together. They were, if you look down the rolls, there was brothers, cousins, uncles. Everybody was related to each other by marriage, by blood. And you know that Alexander just loved these guys, and they loved him.
The flat plain at Gaugamela was well suited for chariot warfare, but Darius went one further and had the ground leveled out to provide runways for his charioteers. This would be a huge set-piece battle, the kind the Persians had trained for. The vast battlefield would allow Darius to send all of his troops into action and use his 5 to 1 advantage to smash Alexander.
A key objective was to break up the massed spearmen of the phalanx. This was notoriously difficult to do. Darius had a plan. scythed chariots. These were standard chariots with long, sharp blades attached to the wheel hubs, capable of separating a man or horse from its legs. They were driven at speed into massed infantry, with one aim: breaking up enemy ranks and creating gaps for their own cavalry and infantry. We now know how Darius deployed his army, because his written instructions were captured after the battle. On the left wing were Bactrian and Scythian cavalry from the steppes of Asia. Their job was to halt the charge of the companion cavalry.